Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar BVCM and Neutralisation, Why Early Action Matters. Today we're diving into the latest draft guidance from the Science Based Target Initiative, which really highlights the need for companies to focus on mandatory interim removal targets. We'll talk about how this new guidance opens the door for businesses to invest earlier in carbon removal projects, and how there's now greater recognition for beyond value chain mitigation, or BVCM. Our goal is to help you understand how companies can start taking active responsibility for their ongoing emissions, especially in light of SBTi's proposed changes. As many of you know, SBTi has launched a consultation on its updated corporate net zero standard, and it brings in some pretty significant changes for how companies tackle their climate impact. To help unpack this, we've put together a three-part webinar series to brief our clients on what we think are the key things businesses need to know, how the SBTi is evolving, and what that means for those aiming to align with the net zero standard. So our first session was back in April. We focused at the time on Scope 3 instruments and the new related guidance. Today is our second webinar in the series, where we'll be diving into BVCM and neutralization. In its latest draft guidance, the SBTi proposes mandatory interim removal targets and increased recognition for BVCM, basically encouraging companies to invest earlier in carbon removal, and take responsibility for ongoing emissions. So over the next 30 minutes, we'll go beyond just the technical definitions to explore what those changes mean for corporate climate strategies and how companies can proactively build a high-quality carbon credit portfolio that aligns with evolving expectations. Before we dive in, just a bit of housekeeping. Everyone is on mute and it will stay that way throughout the whole session. If you have any questions, feel free to pop them into the Q&A box. It should be on your top right corner. We'll answer some of those questions during the Q&A at the end. And if we didn't have the chance to answer your question today, we'll make sure to follow up via email. Finally, the session is being recorded, so we'll send the recording to everyone who registered. Really pleased to be joined today by Lena Paddis and Matt Sprague. Lena is a business development manager working in the carbon credit space within South Pole. Matt is an associate director working in climate advisory, and I'm Benjamin, senior BDM at South Pole, working both on carbon credits and advisory. We've got only 30 minutes, so let's dive into the version 2 of the corporate net zero standard, and I'm going to hand over to you, Matt.
Thanks, Ben. Hi, everybody. Good to be talking to you today about the latest updates. So let's start to discuss version 2 of the Net Zero Standard. And this update reflects significant changes and clarifications to help organizations align with the latest climate science. Okay, let's move to the next slide, please, Ben. As mentioned, the SBTi is revising its corporate net zero standard, and a first draft of version 2 has been published for public consultation. The goal of this draft is to be both more rigorous and practical, incorporating feedback from businesses and multiple stakeholders. The final version is planned for publication in 2026 and will start to take effect in 2027. There is a transition period. So existing near-term targets remain valid until 2030 or their end date, whichever is first. And from 2030 onward, companies must set new targets using version 2.0. So now let's set the scene to understand the key changes and what they mean for your organization. Today, we're focusing on net zero and the SBTi's corporate net zero standard, and particularly the new draft that they issued. Within that, there are multiple changes, but today we're focusing on two key concepts, which are beyond value chain mitigation and neutralization. We'll also distinguish between addressing ongoing emissions versus residual emissions, and we will be presenting the new direction from the SBTi and how to get started in setting strategies towards these 2 points. So let's start by defining some key terms. The standard is full of acronyms, key terms, definitions, and it's important to get our head around each of those in their own right. So ongoing emissions are those released during a company's transition to net zero. So every company has a carbon footprint or a greenhouse gas inventory, and targets are set from that baseline. Emissions between today, or when that baseline was set, and the long-term target year, also known as the net zero target year, those are our ongoing emissions as we decarbonize. Beyond value chain mitigation, or BVCM, as Ben mentioned, refers to efforts to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions outside of a company's own value chain. So this can be done with both avoidance credits and removals credits, and they both count towards this activity. And it typically involves the purchasing of carbon credits, but it can include other actions such as investment in R&D and other low carbon products. Residual emissions, though, are what remain after all abatement measures have been implemented. So what's left after the long-term reduction targets are achieved by 2050 or earlier. So once you achieve your long-term targets, there's typically between 10 to 20% of emissions remaining, and neutralization counterbalances these residual emissions through removals from the net zero year onwards. And companies should address residual emissions through carbon removals. So we'll now be looking at some of the key changes coming with version 2 for both BVCM and neutralization. Go to the next slide as well, please. Fantastic. So BVCM remains a recommendation. Sorry, previous slide. The BVCM still remains a recommendation, not a requirement. However, the SBTi is now suggesting recognition for companies that finance BVCM activities. The criteria for this recognition, such as the scope and scale of the contributions and the status of reduction targets, will be further defined during the consultation process. And the draft also explores the option to make BVCM contributions at the end of target timeframes, so typically every 5 years, rather than annually. BVCM remains a really powerful method for companies to demonstrate climate action as they decarbonize their operations, and purchasing carbon credits remains a fundamental part of global climate action. If we look at neutralization, previously the SBTi required companies to neutralize residual emissions from their net zero target year onward through removal credits. This hasn't changed. So once you achieve your net zero target year, as I said, 2050 at the latest, purchasing removal credits on an ongoing basis for residual emissions is part of that long-term strategy. However, the new draft does introduce some key changes, such as interim removal targets for Scope 1 residual emissions. So within that strategy, looking at setting Scope 1 removal targets between now and the net zero year to counterbalance some of those emissions. And they're also looking at 3 options under consultation. They're looking at requirements, recognitions, and flexibility. The major change, though, in this is around the durability of removals used for neutralisation. And they're looking at a gradual transition, increasing the durability. So firstly, they're looking at setting a gradual increase in the share of removals with higher durability, e.g. geological storage. And durability talks about how long the carbon is stored for once it's removed from the atmosphere. So an example here might be moving from, say, a 5% tech-based removal strategy to 50% by the net zero target year, and slowly shifting from nature-based solutions towards more tech-based removals with longer durabilities. They're also exploring a like-for-like approach. So this sets the minimum durability threshold based on the atmospheric lifetime of those residual greenhouse gases. So under the Kyoto Protocol, each of the greenhouse gases have been given different global warming potentials and include things such as carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, sulfur hexafluoride, and a few others. And each one of those has a different lifetime in the atmosphere before it is broken down and no longer contributes to global warming. So for example, methane typically has a 12 or so year life cycle in the atmosphere. Nitrous dioxide has 120 years, and carbon dioxide is a much longer life cycle in the atmosphere. So trying to match your removal strategy with the life cycle of the emissions that are in those residual footprints could be a consideration the SBTi implements going forwards. So while the requirement remains to neutralise all residual emissions from the net zero year, the new draft introduces the possibility to have scope 3 residual emissions addressed by value chain partners. What this essentially means is that your suppliers can purchase removal credits on your behalf, and you can include that in your net zero and decarbonisation strategy, which is currently not recognised by the standard. Finally, the new standard will provide criteria on what constitute a high integrity removal, but this is to be further explored during the consultation. Now I'll hand you to Lena, who's going to talk us through how to get started in terms of setting your BVCM strategy and neutralisation approach. Over to you, Lena.
Thank you very much, Matt. So yeah, now that we've covered what's changing, I want to now talk to you about what you can actually do next and how you can get started. So let's walk through it. So first of all, next slide, please. Yeah, so first of all, the SBTi is clearly heading in the direction of making carbon credits a core part of climate strategies, not just through the increased recognition of beyond value chain mitigation, but also potentially through mandatory scope 1 removal targets, as Matt mentioned earlier. So we recommend not waiting for final approval to start preparing. The direction is quite clear, and those who move early will be better prepared, both to build a credible strategy, because that takes time, but always also obviously to avoid being caught unprepared once these requirements are formalized. The risk of waiting is also that you could fall behind competitors who are already moving and starting to lock in their strategies, but also especially they're locking in their supply. So as carbon credit obligations become more defined, we're pretty sure that demand for carbon credits, especially for removals, is going to grow. But the problem is supply can't just appear overnight. It takes, especially for removal project, it takes years to develop and to start issuing credits, especially for nature-based ones. So there's a real risk here that demand could grow faster than supply. And to ensure there's enough removal credit supply in the future, it's also critical that buyers not only secure credits early, but they actually also actively support to help grow and enhance the market. Because without that investment and forward demand, the risk isn't just price pressure. The risk is also simply that there's not going to be enough supply to meet future targets. So to sum up this point, secure your supply early, because early movers will have more choice and obviously also better value. And then lastly, integrate the costs into your business. Up until now, many companies have taken a year-by-year approach to buying credits. Partly, obviously, because there's been little external pressure, partly also because price signals have been very unclear. But now, with where things are heading, companies need to start seeing this more as a long-term cost, not just a short-term add-on. And especially given the high cost of removals, it's really important to bring finance teams, your CFOs, into these conversations early to ensure that these costs are embedded into the business. Okay, next slide. So now once you've decided to take action, the next step is figuring out how to structure your approach. We can break this down into 3 stages. First, define your needs. Start by estimating your emissions, both your ongoing emissions, but also your projected residual emissions. This will give you a sense of scale of what you need to address through beyond value chain mitigation and eventually through neutralization. Then make sure your targets are also clearly defined, including any interim goals and also any implications for durability thresholds. For beyond value chain mitigation, we recommend defining a budget. So rather than taking a strict ton for ton approach, moving more towards a money for ton approach. You can define your budget, for example, through defining an internal carbon price. Then second, design your portfolio. So this is where you align your strategy with your broader business goals. So for example, you might want to support projects from specific geographies or ones that deliver specific social or biodiversity co-benefits. And also, depending on your emissions inventory for your removal targets, you may need to consider durability thresholds depending on the outcome of the standard. So yeah, your preferences combined with your targets and obviously also your budget will then help determine your mix. And then third point, choose your procurement approach. So there's no one size fits all here. The right approach really depends on the type of credits you need, the amount of credits you need, your level of risk tolerance, how involved you want to be in climate projects, and obviously also the capacity you have in-house. So some of the main procurement options are, for example, you can do spot purchases to have immediate deliveries. You can do forward offtakes to lock in future volumes and future prices. Or you can also choose to do a direct investment into the early stages of a project, or even a pooled investment through, for example, like a buyers club like NextGen, or through a fund to access a more diversified pipeline of projects. Each of these different procurement approaches come with trade-offs, so it's worth considering which model really fits best with your goals and your capacity. You can also combine different procurement approaches to create a more balanced strategy and spread the risk and opportunities. Okay. And now, how do you then actually execute a strategy once it's developed? So once you've defined your plan, the next step is implementation. And that really starts with reaching out to the right mix of market participants. So depending on your strategy, this could mean you can speak with project developers to understand what specific projects they have in a pipeline, market aggregators to access a more broader range of projects, rating agencies, for example, as well, like B0 or Silvera, data providers like Allied Offset, for example, and even financial intermediaries, including investment banks, who can help structure long-term agreements. So I really think that engaging a range of actors can give you a more complete view of the market, and then that can help you then identify the best path forward based on your goals. And at the same time, like with any major commitment, due diligence is key. That means not just looking at the quality of projects, but also looking at your partners and making sure that they meet your standards of integrity and that they're acting responsibly in the market. Good due diligence protects you in 2 ways. One, obviously, it helps ensure that the work on the ground is actually delivering the climate impact you're paying for. and then it also reduces the risk of delivery failure for your project. And second, it obviously also then reduces your exposure to greenwashing and any reputational risk. Some companies have the internal resources and capacity to manage this due diligence process in-house, but most will actually benefit from support. So for example, you can use trusted rating agencies or independent aggregators who can bring that expertise and transparency. And then lastly, it's important to remember that this market is still evolving. New policies, changing supply and demand dynamics, and improvements in project methodologies will keep shaping what best practices looks like. So it's critical that you stay close to your credit providers, your project partners, your due diligence advisors to track these policy updates, monitor credit issuance and delivery, and then obviously adapt your procurement approach when needed. So in short, that means execution is not just a one-off transaction. It's really an ongoing process that requires the right partnerships, careful risk management, and making sure that you're staying engaged over time. Okay, so this was all quite theoretical. So I'd like to now look at a real-world example of how a company is putting this into practice. So I think Salesforce is a great example for this. They've been active in the voluntary carbon market for several years now, and they've been purchasing carbon credits for their beyond value chain mitigation. They're offsetting all three scopes, and they choose to rely on independent third-party ratings to help identify and select high quality and high integrity projects. They've also taken an early role in catalyzing new climate projects. So for example, they've joined buyers coalitions like LEAF or Symbiosis to support nature-based projects at the pre-finance stage. And also beyond nature-based projects, Salesforce is already securing long-term offtake agreements for technical carbon removals. So things like direct air capture or other engineered solutions. This not only helps scale the technologies, but it also ensures for them that they will have access to a reliable supply of high-quality removals when they will need them to neutralize any residual emissions in the future. Okay, so now to finish, I want to leave you with some key recommendations to help you get started on building a robust beyond value chain mitigation and neutralization strategy. Next slide, thanks. So first of all, build knowledge. I think before you start engaging with carbon markets, it's really important to take this time to understand the landscape, the risks, the opportunities, the best practices. It's a really complex market, so it's really important to understand it and build this internal knowledge around what are the different types of credits that are available, from avoidance to removals, from nature-based to tech-based solutions. What are some of the key quality criteria to consider, like additionality, permanence, leakage, etc. And also becoming familiar with the major standards and certification frameworks, how they work and what different types of methodologies they issue credits for. And then second, focus on due diligence. So as I mentioned before, once you've developed your strategy, execution starts with due diligence. This means investigating the projects you're considering, whether that's through internal teams, third-party ratings, or dedicated due diligence partners. And I think it's also really important to work closely with project developers to get transparent, reliable information on project performance and risk. So yeah, the key message here is, treat this like any other serious investment, do the groundwork, pick the right partners, and stay informed as the market evolves. Okay, that's it from me. I'll pass it back to Ben. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lena. Thank you, Lena, for those very valuable insights. Let's take a look at some of the questions coming through. We've got a few minutes, so we'll be able to do a few of them. Lena, Matt, feel free to jump in. First question, what key due diligence questions should we be asking of our partners?
Yeah, I can take that one. Yeah, I think that's a good question. I would say I would start first by asking them what their own due diligence process is, what their policies are, how they manage this carbon credit quality and the risks that come with it. I think also what defines a quality or what quality means and what defines a high integrity project can be quite different for each organization. Every organization has their own set of quality criteria. There are some that are more widely known and recognized, like, for example, obviously additionality, permanence. These are all key things to consider. But you could also ask around social and environmental safeguards if that's important for your organization as a quality criteria. Like, for example, what is the stakeholder engagement that was done? What is the benefit sharing mechanism of the project? A lot of this type of information is actually included in project design documents or like any monitoring and evaluation reports that are done on the project. So you can also just ask your partner, project developer, for any kind of documentation if it's not already available online. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Lena. Another one. I'm not sure if we'll have time for a third one, but another interesting one: are avoidance credits still relevant nowadays?
Yeah, I can take that one, Ben. It's a really important question, and it's good to see on the chat. Absolutely, avoidance credits are still essential to achieving global net zero. It's essential to preserve our existing carbon sinks, our forests, and our oceans, in addition to increasing them through removal technologies. But by supporting energy efficiency projects, renewable energy projects, avoided deforestation, and many other approaches, it helps stop the problem getting worse, whilst we also try and make the problem better at the same time. So the SBTi's recognition through the BVCM framework is a good guide of the importance there, and we've got a lot of other NGOs and standard setters such as the CCP and the ICBCM setting more and more guidance around how to use credits towards climate strategies and supporting climate action.
Thanks, Matt. There are quite a few other questions on the chat, but for a matter of time, we'll get back to everybody's question via email anyway. Thanks, Matt and Lena, for your insights and answers. Before we wrap up, just a quick look ahead to our next session in the series. The next one will be on climate transition plans, new expectations. It will be on the 28th of May. Basically, this session aims to give you again valuable insights on how strong transition plans not only support companies in hitting their net zero targets, but also serve as strategic tools for competitiveness, for investment attraction, and driving long-term growth and innovation. In this session, we'll break down the draft guidance, explain how SBTi applies it, and explore every business case for strong CTPs, climate transition plans, helping companies navigate risk, build resilience, and align with investors' regulatory and strategic expectations. For those who may not know us, we're South Pole, we're the climate company. We provide climate solutions globally and specialize around sustainability, nature, carbon markets, and more. We've been doing this for nearly 20 years, and we bring that experience to everything we do. We are leading consultancy dealing with a lot of different topics such as Scope 3, climate risk, target setting, and so on. We also seller of environmental certificates and one of the largest carbon project asset developer in the world. We've got a team of 800 people globally in around 30 different offices with a strong presence right here in APAC. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us today. We hope this session gave you some useful insights. If you haven't already, don't forget to register to the final webinar in the series on climate transition plans, the one I mentioned a second ago. It's on the 28th of May. I know there is quite a few people who were here at the first webinar. Hope that you will be at the last one as well. Don't miss this opportunity to stay ahead of all those critical updates, and they are quite often. So yeah, register now, and we'll see you there. Thank you again, and have a great day.